So welcome everybody to the fourth of these sessions, these discussions on assessment in BC. Before we start and before I introduce Marc, I do want to say that at the end of this session, we're going to talk a little bit about the next few sessions that are going to happen, because we have sessions planned for you in April, May, and June as well. They're going to have a slightly different format and a slightly different structure and how we come into the sessions as well, but we'll lay all that out at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Marc Garneau. Thank you, Marc, for agreeing to be the guest chair today and sharing some ideas around assessment in BC. Marc is a helping teacher in Surrey, has been so for 18 years and has been on the BC Association of Math Teachers Executive for 20 years and is a tour de force in math education in BC. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say, Marc.
All right, thank you, Peter. I will start sharing my screen and we'll get rolling. And welcome to a bunch of new faces as well. It looks like we've gotten some more people involved, and that's great, especially as we transition to this new phase, as Peter talked about. It'll be great to have some more people on board. Just going to make sure I can see the chat, because you can interrupt me at any time. I may ignore you, not because I'm ignoring you, but just because I'm in the flow of something and I might not have noticed your message. But don't hesitate to get involved in the chat, and other people can respond there as well. Yeah, so you notice I put this little BCMT logo in the top right, because I'm kind of the bridge between where this began and where it's going, and the BCMT will be more closely involved as it goes forward, but more on that at the end. So this is about, the title is New Light Through an Old Window, which has a particular meaning, which I will get to a couple of times throughout this. But my primary focus is going to be around assessing content. And I'll say more about all the things that get involved in doing that. I would like to acknowledge the shared traditional territory for my home school district in Surrey, the Coast Salish people on which Surrey schools are located, recognize the Kitsimmee First Nations who have signed the Aboriginal Education Enhancement Agreement. I'd also like to acknowledge all the other territories represented with the people wherever you are participating from today. So just as a quick little start here, the Kdu model is pretty much what motivates everything I'm going to talk about today, and that's what guides our new curriculum as its foundation. We have the know, the content, the do, the competencies, and then the understand with the big ideas. And as these merge together, concepts are developed. But from an assessment point of view, big ideas are not to be assessed, at least explicitly. It's impossible to ignore them. And so these are what we look at from an assessment point of view. And our focus today is on content. So we'll say bye-bye to curricular competencies, not actually. But I do think it is important, and I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk about content, because I find with a lot of things that I've seen and heard around people shifting their assessment practice, that the content, we don't necessarily hear about the details of that, or maybe a lot of it looks similar. And I think a lot of it can look similar, but I think that there are some new places we can go. And this is an invitation to consider some of what I'll be talking about today. And I can't really do content justice without the competencies. So those will be with us alongside and supporting our assessment of content as we go through. So an opening problem. I always like to start where we get to do a little bit of math, but this is going to be a little bit different. Here I have two fractions, and I'm kind of cutting to the chase of where we're going with this, about comparing these fractions. And so what I would like you to do for the moment is think for yourself, how would you compare these fractions? And then also think, what might students do? What might students do to compare these fractions? So give that some thought. Feel free to type something into the chat if you like. And in a minute or so, I'll throw up some possible student approaches. Okay, I love seeing all these responses. And part of this problem as well is I know we've got a broader audience today than just secondary. So I'll be kind of weaving in some elementary and secondary topics as we go through. I love to see the reference to the benchmark of a half. That would certainly be my hopeful intention in a response, but there are certainly some other approaches. And I even saw one or more incorrect approaches. So I'm just going to throw up here some possible student responses. And as you are sort of browsing those, they are not all correct mathematically. Some have incorrect reasoning. I think 2 or 3 of them do. Um, some have an accurate answer, but they chose different ways of thinking about it, be it through a representation or some kind of symbolic understanding, or even if it's symbolic, looking at that benchmark of a half, which is sort of this middle green one. I tried to use the colors of the rainbow. I even Googled how does indigo and violet differ? And that was hopefully accurate in there. But regardless of what, whether, I mean, this is not an exhaustive list, but what it draws attention to is that when we ask a question, and this is a content related question, the kind of things that we see in response all informs us of something. And we can do more, and you can see some of these are providing some of their reasoning there. And we need to prompt for that reasoning, because if we really want to see what do they know and what can they do, which to me is what the assessment is all about, there's a lot we can see. And so as teachers, it's about anticipating the kinds of responses. It's also about trying to define what are we looking for in a response here? What are we looking for? And when we don't see that, what are we seeing? What understanding is there that we can connect to or build from? Now, around this problem, like I said, I think it could be when we think of the KDU and trying to bring um, the action of doing mathematics into the content of mathematics. We can do that as simply as just giving a prompt, like explain how you know. But there are a couple of other prompts that we could consider here as well, like which representation did you choose to defend your answer, and why did you choose this representation? And connected to that, what are 2 fractions for which you would choose a different representation to compare, and explain why? This is kind of thinking about, I want my students' learning experiences to become comfortable with different representations of fractions and sort of develop towards that idea of being able to strategically choose which one works best for which situation. Another route we can go with comparing fractions might be this is kind of an open problem. What could numbers A and B be to make this statement true? Or what if the B were down here instead? So this again invites a lot of different responses. It also invites a different range of responses. Are they just plugging in numbers that work? Or are they seeing some relationship between A and B? By anticipating what I may see, we can envision that there are a range of different responses. So these sort of ideas of these kind of prompts and questions is taking a familiar question like compare fractions and shining a new light on it in terms of what else can we do with it to kind of draw that deeper evidence of what they know and can do. So that's what this sort of vision is about of a new light through an old window. I think a lot of what we have been doing in assessing content, even over many years, it's not that we throw it all away. It's just that we're going to bring a new light to it and see, both in terms of how do we, ask the same kind of questions that we did before, and also what are some sort of new ways that we can ask questions to be able to assess where they're at with their content. So just a very quick bit of background. I really appreciated hearing from the previous three speakers, Phil, Mike, and Rob, about their background and so on. And that's what I mentioned for Surrey schools, because that's where most of my time is spent working. What we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be connecting to standards-based assessment, and I've spent a few summers doing remedial grade 10 summer school, and so I thought, I've heard a lot about this, let me try it. So I've had the opportunity to put these ideas into practice, at least some of them. When I go back and do it again, I'm going to have some new ideas to try to bring into that. But I've learned a lot from that, and so I may make reference to that later on. Also, in our district last year, we invited secondary teachers to take part in a project focused on this, and we had a high percentage of our high schools participating with at least a teacher, if not two or more teachers from each school. Sometimes it infected the whole department. And so we've had a lot of teachers working on these ideas. This year, we're expanding that to elementary. And a lot of elementary teachers have already been doing some things, just like in our high schools, people have been doing some things before. So a lot of different things are happening. I'm extremely excited seeing how the practices of assessment have been shifting. And I have learned a lot through that process. So when I've been doing a lot of workshops around assessing math, and I like to cover these 5 main areas. Some of these will be done very quickly, others will spend some time and dig deep into it. Our focus is on assessing content, but I can't help but, in order to kind of get a sense of what is he even talking about by the end of it, I kind of need to go through these things. I'm also doing this because we have a lot of people who hadn't been to the previous 3 sessions, or maybe people who'll be watching the recording who haven't been to the previous 3 sessions. So I thought I'd give a kind of an overview of a lot of this thinking, and then it'll all funnel down into what does it look like for content. As such, at times it may feel like this, trying to drink from a fire hydrant. So what I'm doing today will feel like the fire hydrant. It's like, whoa, there's way too much. But just keep in mind, you don't need that much water to satisfy your thirst. There may just be something, even just one thing that you see that you might want to pick up and try. Any shift in that direction, I think, is a positive move. And then those little shifts end up supporting each other. And so the other ones become easier to manage as you go along. So in the end, what you might end up doing with this might be something that's just one thing. And that's what we're going to encourage you to do. Some of you are already on your way in that journey, and maybe there's some new idea that you might tweak and so on. So take a deep breath. Yes, I'll be going through a lot of stuff, but in the end, it's all connected. And all that really matters to me is that we care to really try to find out what our students know and can do, and help them to understand better what they know and what they can do. So I'm going to be very brief on what standards-based assessment is, just because I think it's a little better known than it was maybe just a few years ago, and the others have talked a lot about it. My quickest summary of it is it's a quality over a quantity. So the quantitative approach looks at performance determined by points gathered, whereas with quality, what I'm doing is the performance is determined by the evidence of proficiency of a learner. So in other words, to what level have they shown evidence of learning with respect to learning standards? Under both lenses, students are doing stuff. They're doing they're answering questions, they're doing tasks. But in the points gathering system, it's about how many questions are correct, or parts of questions are correct for partial credit. But when we bring a qualitative lens, it matters a lot about, well, which questions or which tasks are they doing and how well are they doing them. To kind of highlight this difference, consider under a points-based system, these two quiz scores. As an assessment, they both report out exactly the same thing, 7 out of 10. But if we look at which questions they got correct, there are very different stories here. And so I would like our assessment to reflect those differences in some way. And it's not even just about which questions are correct or not. It's, what else is there that we can look at beyond correct answers to figure out what they know and can do. So my focus will be on looking at assessment through a qualitative lens, looking at evidence, and doing that with respect to learning standards. And of course, our learning standards, as I mentioned at the beginning, are the curricular competencies and the content. And so what this will finally boil down to is we need to be looking for and knowing what we're looking for with respect to competencies, with respect to content. And many teachers as well like to put those two things together. And certainly, no matter what we do, I think we'll be looking at both. It's just a question of whether we separate them out and look at those in parts, or we look at the whole, or we look at all three. All right, so this whole idea though of, do I assess content? Do I assess competencies? Do I assess these sort of merged together ideas? No metaphor is a good metaphor. So I'm sure you could pick this apart like crazy, but at least allow me to give me some license to use this as a metaphor. Let's say we're assessing pizza. And so all of these are pieces of evidence. Now I can assess the pizza, but I can also consider the different things that go into how good of a pizza is it. And when I think about what every pizza has in common, it's got a crust, it's got sauce, and it's got cheese. Those things can change, but they're always present in a pizza. To me, those are kind of like the curricular competencies, because no matter what students are doing, especially if we give them those opportunities to prompt for those competency things, then we want those always present. The content is like the topics, okay? They can vary. Some topics are connected with each other. They go well together. Other topics maybe, we wouldn't put on the same pizza. So I look at, when I'm assessing evidence, my choice is to kind of look at it this way. I look at the single piece of evidence. I see competencies and I see content, and I can look at both of them and make some evaluation of each of those kinds of things. But we can't ignore this fact that this sort of whole pizza effect either. It's like, that's a good pizza, or that's not a good pizza. So that comes into play as well. But that's a teacher's choice as to how you want to structure how your assessment of competencies and content go together. So from a learning standard point of view, and we talk about standards-based learning, there's a little bit, I'm going to keep using the word standards, but it doesn't mean I'm necessarily referring to exact curriculum standards. Sometimes it's called outcome-based or focused around learning goals. So I may take a content standard like multiplication and division concepts, and yet my learning standards may actually separate those out into multiplication concepts and division concepts. Then I might look at, well, what competencies might show themselves or that I might intentionally look for with respect to these concepts. And so if I were looking to make a standard that connects those two things, I might, for example, focus on multiplication, the representations and how those representations connect, and then form this connected standard. connect different representations of multiplication together. Okay, so these are some different options. For myself, I would have multiplication concepts as a standard. I'd have some competencies as separate standards. Other teachers like to put them together and list those as their standards. So when we talk about standards-based assessment, these are just some quick examples of what those standards could look like. By the way, at the end, I will be sharing a link to these slides. So all these sort of detailed things that might show up, I'm not going to read through all of them. They're just there so that you know that they're there. And then when you look at the PDF of the slides afterwards, then you can look at some of the details. But I thought I'd throw in some other examples of where you have content and competencies blended together to form some standards for assessment. All right, so looking at content then, and if we're considering content learning standards, question always comes up as to how many. Hopefully by the end of this, that'll be a little bit clearer, but even as just sort of an initial look at this, let's take a topic like operations with fractions in Math 8, and we have 4 operations as well as order of operations. We also have the kinds of fractions that those are operated on, whether they be proper, improper, and mixed, because there are, some differences there in terms of how we make sense of those. And so the question may be, well, does that then make 15 standards? It could, but I think you're being, you'd be being far too nuanced or get far too detailed. And ultimately, the growth of learning that's going through this topic isn't isolated into those 15 little boxes, but we can see and describe sort of that growth across those. So for me, the distinction between proper, improper, and mixed, to me, rather informs a progression across a standard rather than different standards themselves. So for me, this would not be 15, it would be 2 or 3. If it were 3, it would be something like I would maybe combine adding and subtracting together. I might combine multiplying and dividing together, and perhaps have a separate one for order of operations. I'd have to think some more about how I would describe each of those and see whether or not they are separated. And then, the ideas of, well, adding and subtracting are connected to multiplying and dividing. Well, connecting is an important curricular competency that I'd be looking for evidence on, and that's where some things like that are going to go. So even when I separate content and competencies, there's so much interplay between them that, my assessment of competencies is, includes looking at the content that they did it with, and my assessing of content still looks at the competencies that were part of those experiences and evidence. So that's a summary of standards-based assessment. The multiple sources of evidence, again, I won't say much about this because this is much more known than it used to be in terms of looking at different sources of evidence. What I do like to bring up about it is that when we're looking at it through a standards-based lens, when we're looking at evidence of learning, then all of a sudden, the idea that it's not the same for all students is natural instead of something to worry about. Of course, it's going to be different for all students because we're looking at, what they know and they can do, and that could come through various different sources of evidence. Nor do we need all 3 sources. We gather evidence of different types, and we're looking for that alignment between them. And if we don't have a particular kind, that's okay if the other 2 kinds agree. And the other thing to keep in mind is that it's based upon a body of evidence, not just those individual moments. We make a record of those individual moments, but ultimately we are looking at it as a body of evidence to make our assessment decisions. All right, so we're going to take a deeper dive into proficiency. And perhaps you're already feeling the fire hydrant coming. So I apologize for that, but if we are patient and we can kind of go through and just try to wrap our minds around some ideas and think about something you may take away from this. So in the past, my own assessment practice, and many people even still today, might assess things that have a mark. Others may use things like a rubric, and this is the old performance standard rubric. I guess it's still the current performance standard rubric because it hasn't been replaced yet. There are qualities about these that I'd like to draw out, because I think once we bring in the KDU and we think about what students, when we're looking for what they know and can do, then we need to go for something more than this, something fundamentally different. So as the curriculum has been unfolding and classroom assessment practice and provincial assessment has come out, these labels have emerged. Maybe the labels in your district are a little bit different. But there are some teachers, in fact, some districts that say, oh, that's okay. All you do is just kind of move these over here. And then the assessment doesn't change. We just slap new labels on them. And I say no to that. That is not what those proficiency labels are about. It's not just new names for old ideas on assessment. When I look at especially that performance standard rubric, and to a certain extent those scores as well, there's expectation language. So, this minimally meets, fully meets, not yet within, it's all about expectations. Even a quiz or a test score has an expectation of this is what this is worth. This work is worth a certain number of points, and you're expected to get as many points as you can, if not the total amount. They're also very task focused. A lot of the language of this is, on the task, on the task. These scores are recorded as events, as in Peter's book, he calls it event-based. So those are, individual moments. So they're very task focused. And there's a lot of negative language, be it, the score in terms of the ones that are wrong. The language in here, with without often inefficient, unable to, unsystematic. The negative way of describing the learning here is something that is characteristic of those things. And I invite us to think about this differently. So when I think of the KDU and I think of assessment, I'd like to transition from expectation language to proficiency language, which we're still uncovering, from being task focused to being learning focused, that is evidence of learning focused, and trying to move away from the negative language and focus on positive language. What do they know and what can they do? That's the positive sort of phrase of thinking about it. So what really helped me wrap my head around this was actually the core competencies that came out through the ministry, and how they developed, had these profiles. And the profiles were, it's actually a Venn diagram. So everything described in profile 1 is true of the student at profile 4. I think in Peter's book, he refers to them as backwards compatible. So this idea that we are describing a growth, we are describing some kind of progression. So there is descriptive language across those profiles, and it is a progression, and the things are adding on as they go along. So what I did is I took that idea and I thought, okay, what does that look like from, if those are around core competencies, then what about curricular competencies, and what about even content? And I came up with this Venn diagram, which didn't look like this initially. It used to look like the core competency one, but people have suggested ideas and kind of made it their own. So I don't know exactly whose this is at this point. I know it's where I started, and this kind of feels right with where my thinking is right now. So looking at these proficiency levels as a Venn diagram, to me is a really huge shift in how we understand these proficiency levels. Okay, we can't take that performance standard rubric of not yet meeting and put it in a Venn diagram like this, because there isn't overlap there. It's what is lacking. Can we be descriptive of what these are? Can we be descriptive in a way that makes it progressive and additive as we go along, and doing so using positive language? So that's been my goal with trying to describe assessment of both competencies and content. So rather than always drawing it in that Venn diagram, I like to look at a sort of a 4-column kind of thing. And you'll kind of notice with the styling there that there's a bit of a Venn diagram look to it. So I still want those ideas, which I've put at the bottom there, going through. And we'll take a look at a moment. And so the learning standard is growing across. For those of you that have read Peter's book, you know he has that similar idea. There won't be complete, this isn't equivalent to what Peter's doing, it's just a different look. And he talks about, you know, that sort of 2-column extreme kind of descriptions, or middle column proficient kind of description. And I'm just taking a different approach as to how we can describe these proficiency levels across that growth. So even though our focus is content today, just to give you an idea of what this could look like for a competency. So say I'm looking at this idea about using multiple strategies to engage in problem solving. So I can think about the strategy approach, where we're, you know, ranging from, you know, I can develop and use some multiple strategies to I can use a given strategy. The extending person is making flexible and strategic choices of strategy. But even at the emerging level, there's some kind of positive description of what they can do in terms of where they're going. You know, students can then see, you know, in order to be able to move to the next level, they should be able to see what does it mean to be able to do that. There's also an aspect of, with this competency, not just about the strategies, but also the kinds of problems. And I used to describe this in words, but then last night I thought a visual would be much easier for me to make sense of. When I think about the familiarity of the situation or the problem and the complexity. And maybe familiarity isn't the right word there, but I was kind of leaning towards trying to think about, you know, those sort of those non-routine kind of problems that students do as being more towards that extending end. And so it kind of ended up looking something like this across the scale. And I can kind of think about, you know, where I see as evidence, where I could kind of map it onto this, and then make my evaluation as to this evidence supports the idea that they are proficient or developing or what have you. Okay, but we're here today to look at content. I just want to take a quick interlude here to say, for those who were here at the first 3 sessions, I really appreciated their, you know, slow and thoughtful going through things. Like, it was very, you know, gradually uncovering ideas and showing things. And compared to them, this is like a big blast of information. So like I said, little bits here. Ultimately, it's all connected. And let's see now with how we take all those ideas that I've talked about and translate it into looking at content. So one thing with content is thinking about some kind of learning progression. And I'm not, there's lots of ideas out there about what learning progressions look like. And I'm just going to take a very simple look at it from the point of view of topics. So for example, solving equations, which actually begins much earlier than grade 6, but just to describe what it looks like from 6 through 12. You know, these are what the curriculum defines as different items upon which, you know, that they're progressing through. There are, of course, other aspects of solving equations that are growing through this progression. And those continually, you know, as they get applied to new instances of the kinds of numbers that are involved, those are growing as well. But there's another dimension here, and part of it's what I just spoke of, but I like to call it depth. And when I look at depth, there's different ways of describing it. Ultimately, I'm just thinking about depth of understanding within a place along that learning progression. So one way of describing that is what the ministry uses, the depths of knowledge. I prefer to refer to them as depths of understanding. And a lot of this is just, what is required um, to be successful through a task. Are they just recalling and reproducing, or is there some strategic thinking going on there? So this isn't the only way of doing it, but it is a way. And notice as well that there's a lot of competencies at the foundation of what these are about. So that's just one kind of thing to keep in mind there. So not only do we have progression going across, we also have depth going down. So ultimately, the journey of learning content, we can kind of look at as a spectrum of, and it's not linear, which is what helps to look at it in 2 dimensions. But there's at the same time as we're progressing across, we're also progressing deeper. I'm finding to this day, I'm still learning more and understanding more about grade 2 level subtraction, for example. Like the depth does not finish. I don't, there's no mastery in the end. There's always more and more that we can uncover about a concept. But from an assessment point of view, ultimately we're looking at one particular grade. So let's say in grade 9, I could sequence the different progression of learning along the way that we would do with solving equations. The idea that there is, that there are modeling and solving problems through each of these phases as well that I would be conscious of. And so from an assessment point of view, these are the kinds of things that I would be looking for. And maybe here as well, there could even be this kind of idea where we're looking at the 2 dimensions and thinking about, how would we evaluate a piece of evidence based upon that in these 2-dimension ideas. That's thinking way ahead, but something that I invite you to consider. So I'll say more about that, and we'll get into details of content in a little bit. The other aspect to consider is what some teachers do, like I said, is put the content and competencies together, and we could be descriptive there as well. I personally don't have experience of trying to write positive descriptions across the levels of when we've got it blended, but I can sort of envision what that would look like. And I know there's at least there's some of my elementary teachers that I'm working with that are going to be trying that. So I will be learning along the way as to what that may look like. So, but just to kind of paint a picture of where this is all going. So that's the idea for a particular topic, but for a student record, then it would end up, having this sort of a table of sorts, and this can look different as it goes on, but ultimately it's based upon a description. It's not in the student table, but we are an attachment of trying to be descriptive of what that looks like so that students understand where they're at and where they're going, at least at the proficient level. And so, as a starting place, at least try to define what is it you're looking for to decide on what proficient means, at the same time as using positive language. And then if possible, across the proficiency levels, thinking about that additive and progressiveness across there. That is the ultimate goal of a place to get to. But you don't have to get there before you can start doing these kinds of things. Like I said, even just focusing around what proficient means and so on. So overall, a student might have a record sheet like this. And so for me, it's about content and competency standards. And then keeping track of what evidence I'm seeing. And as new evidence comes into play, those things can change. I like to use date codes so I can kind of track, sort of growth. In Peter's book, he uses other kinds of coding, which I think is really cool. And I'd like to explore that for myself as well. Coding of, was it a group assessment? Was it an observation? And so there's a whole idea that we could get in there as to how else we could code this in order to make that final determination. But I won't go into those details here. But ultimately, it might look something like this, even with different coding. And so, I might have my content standards and my competency standards. Competencies, by the way, some like to group them by the headers, and that works for me as well, whether communicating and representing as a standard. I like to separate them into the 7 or 8 kind of headings there. But of course, it can also be put together. And so maybe one of my standards would be putting those two together, solving two-step equations with integers using multiple representations. Okay. So looking back at everything I've covered so far, kind of a quick summary of this idea of those, task-based assessment versus standards-based. One is looking at tasks, the other is looking at learning. As such, a lot of task-based things are mostly content. When I think about tests and quizzes and that kind of thing, not that they have to be, that is generally are. The performance tasks and performance standards did look at some, they weren't called competencies, but some sort of things there, but they were still very task-focused. Instead of points being gathered, we're looking at gathering evidence of that learning. So instead of the quantitative approach of how many did they get, it's about the qualitative thing about, how well are they doing? From a triangulation of evidence perspective, we can gather from all kinds of different sources that we're looking at, and all of them have equal kind of value. Under the task base, there's such a thing as earning extra marks or credit. And that just is meaningless in a standards-based approach. It's not about doing more work to get more credit. It's about providing new evidence of learning. And so we shift away from this expectation to language to proficiency language that is positive, additive, and progressive. So those are the first 3. I'll touch on grading a little bit at the end. How's our time doing? Okay, we got about 15 minutes. All right. I'll have to be, because we're going to up to 5 o'clock, but we'd like some time for some questions and answers. So I'm going to start going a little bit quicker here. So from a design perspective then, we need to know what to look for, and we need to give students opportunities to demonstrate that. So a couple of ideas. You can provide questions which are aimed at all students, but what they do can show a progression of responses. And we could also have questions which target specific proficiency levels. So I'm just going to unpack these quickly. So some examples of things that you can give students as assessment opportunities as ways to show evidence: open questions, rich problems, routines, performance tasks, competency prompts. I'll take a look at a couple of these with some examples. And again, a PDF of the slides is there, so you can go back and see some of the details here as I quickly go through some examples. Sort of one of my favorite kind of open questions is, the answer to the question is 10. What could the question be? And to think about the kind of range of responses that you might get there could be very indicative of where they're at. And it says the answer to a question doesn't mean it has to be a computation. So maybe they're writing a problem, or they're doing some kind of probability simulation or whatever that could have an answer of 10. So there's a lot of richness even in a question as simple as that. This is one for Marion Small. Choose 3 numbers less than 100, and looking at where those points are on the number line and how they are spaced, and that can reveal a lot about their sense of number up to 100. You can even do this kind of thing in other grades, thinking about less than 0 or between 0 and 1, or less than 2 pi as well. The sort of proportionality between radian measures. Open Middle at openmiddle.com is filled with these kind of missing digit questions and trying to come up with optimal solutions based upon that. So that can reveal a lot of kinds of things. Here's a grade 8 example of operations of an open middle where you're replacing the boxes and trying to produce. So there's many different answers for these, but it's a lot of, what thinking goes into, what strategy goes into trying to decide on a good solution or an optimal solution. Routines, like which one doesn't belong, number talks. This is a thing called menu math. And with a menu math, it's about, this is from Nat Banting, who brought this to our math teaching world, where you have some conditions and students are trying to satisfy them. So a student could satisfy these with 10 different linear functions. And that tells me something. That's good. That's a good thing. They understand what each of these things means individually. But the student who can look at some of these and strategically combine or strategically not combine because they know they can't go together, that reveals some more about their understanding of the content. Here's an example at younger grades of thinking about numbers that you can model using base 10 blocks. Again, same idea. Which of these clues can be done together to represent a number, which ones cannot, and how many different numbers, what's the least number of numbers you can do to satisfy all the conditions. Competency prompts. This one I think is a nice place to start as well if you're thinking about something to try, because even with routine questions like I showed earlier, we can take a routine question about comparing and bring the competencies in, and so there's not only competencies I can look at here, but the competencies help to reveal their understanding of the content. So competencies are a powerful vehicle for seeing what they understand about the content. Other kinds of prompts that you can use when assessing content, but using competencies, agree or disagree, choose and justify, creating a problem, solve it incorrectly and explain why somebody might do that mistake. These are the kinds of prompts that I like to do. And again, not every single question, but being intentional about when I do choose to use these kinds of prompts. You could also think about unit level prompts, and again, without reading them all, these are some that I have used in Foundations and Pre-Calculus 10. For example, which of the 3 forms of equations of lines do you prefer to graph? And why is that your choice? And this was just focusing on the graphing aspect. There could be a different question which asks, when would you choose a certain form, maybe in terms of modeling, which forms lend themselves to modeling. So kind of after a unit of study to reflect back and think about, why did we learn these? Why did we learn these? Why are they important? What can we do with them? So those were about kind of the same questions aimed at everyone, but a lot of the work that our secondary teachers were doing in Surrey was this targeting specific proficiency levels with questions. And this is going to be kind of similar to what Peter talks about in his book about the basic, intermediate, and advanced questions. But I'll choose to bring that same proficiency language here. Just a quick thing. I don't think it's about context doesn't necessarily distinguish levels, because I can ask simple questions about context, or the context itself can be a simple context versus a more complex context. It's not about harder numbers. We're not getting, numbers, if I'm doing surface area and volume, I'm not getting at a higher level of proficiency with that just by throwing in fractions or decimals. That's a number thing. I want to focus on what makes something conceptually progressive within that concept. And again, bringing up this novelty familiarity as well may be something we have to consider when we are targeting proficiency levels. So we need to know what to look for. And so it begins by trying to define for a particular topic what we're looking for. So I'm going to choose a grade 1 or 2 outcome in terms of looking at repeating patterns. And I can define, that's sort of what I think about, what does it mean to be proficient? What is my hope here? And for this grade, it's about, 3 or more elements in a repeating pattern. And then, and if that's all I do, that's great. That's enough to work from. But I also, if you can, try to think about what other levels could look like. And so I'm looking at the complexity of the pattern, extending maybe where there's 2 cores that are merging together at the same time is a very sort of advanced look at a repeating pattern. But I might also go further and be mindful of, there's many different things we do with patterns, and so in terms of depth, there's a real difference between, can I identify a pattern, identify its core all the way up to using a pattern to predict, to creating a pattern. So ultimately, maybe we could get to a place where, we're looking at it like this, where we're looking at those 2 dimensions of depth and progression and thinking about what they look like. So as I look at a piece of evidence, I can kind of map it onto this grid and then make the determination there. Again, that's sort of the place. I'm not even here yet, really, with what I've done and planned, but it's a place I'd kind of like to explore and get to. So again, I think it's good, even if we just kind of come back to here, think of a topic, in this case, for example, ordering, comparing fractions. Think about what proficiency could look like. Think, if we can, about what the other levels could look like. Trying to describe a progression, trying to be using positive language as well. And so now that I have these descriptions of what I am looking for, I can then, in terms of giving students opportunities to demonstrate that, I can now provide questions which target these things that I'm looking for. So for each of these things that I'm looking for, I can, write up some questions that are actually going to ask for that so students can show it. So for example, here's some examples of what my proficient questions might look like, if that's what I'm looking to assess. I'm going to run by that because I know we can go back and look at the slides. So earlier, we had this grid of looking at Math 8 operations, and we can almost now apply sort of proficiency ideas to there. Again, you might disagree with this, and all within this realm. I'm looking. Notice there's no extending here because I think this E here doesn't mean extending; it means emerging. I should have put EM there. I think once you get into extending, you're looking at going, beyond just the kinds of questions that you're asked, but the sort of strategic thinking, connecting, generalizing, that comes into making. We could do a whole workshop on what extending could look like. So this idea of a new light through an old window, then, your tests or quizzes, if you've used tests or quizzes before, might have had all these kinds of questions on it, but they were just put on there as I want some easy questions, I want some middle questions, and I want some hard questions. But if we rethink about those in terms of what are we looking for in a progression of learning, considering depth and so on, then we're bringing that new light, this sort of qualitative light, onto that. And so even though in the end we might be using a lot of similar questions, it now has a whole new meaning from an assessment perspective. Plus, through that light, we can also, bring in those other things, like really pushing those competencies and those competency prompts to make the content come alive. All right, so from a design point of view, how am I doing here? All right, 3 minutes. I mean, if we go a little bit over, I know it's okay, but I'd like to try to wrap it up. So from a design, because I know a lot of teachers, they still want to give quizzes and tests, and that's okay. I think we just have to reimagine what this can look like. So for a particular standard, what would look like for me was, I may have had some kind of that kind of question which is aimed at all students. It's the same question for all. And then I had, different questions at different levels there. And so, for example, when I was thinking about the second degree polynomials in grade 10, I tried to describe what I was looking for in those at those different levels, again using that positive language and so on. And then that translated into deciding on questions to ask that I was looking for. And so this is what students would give. And students had some choice about which parts, they were kind of targeting for themselves what level of evidence were they hoping to show me and proving it here. And it's not just about the getting questions right. I'm looking at this qualitatively, and so it's sometimes it's a mixture of the different things work that I see here when I make that final sort of determination. And but from a practical point of view, like when students do their work on this, it actually goes a lot quicker than if I were marking this out of 20. Because if I'm marking this whole thing out of 20, I am looking for every little part mark I can find, and I'm scrutinizing over, what they're showing me. Is this a 2 out of 3 or a 2.5 out of 3? And I wasted so much time trying to do that. When I bring the sort of qualitative lens to it, it actually goes very quickly, especially, and like what Rob talked about last time with exemplars, you can kind of look at your class as a whole and start to see those patterns in their responses, and it just makes the actual marking of it go a lot quicker. So if it's a test, then there might be more than one learning standard on there. And these aren't just single opportunities either. I would give other opportunities for students to show me what they know. But in this particular test, let's say it was around these 3 learning standards, and I report out a proficiency level, proficient, proficient, developing. So from a reassessment point of view, not reassessment, but new evidence of learning, a student might look at that developing and say, you know what, I think I've learned enough that I really think I can show proficient. So I don't have to give them these 3 new pages of a completely revised test. I can just give them that section for the standard that they're doing. And I don't have to give them that whole thing. If you want to show me proficient, then maybe just show me the developing and proficient questions, or try the extending as well, because I'd like to see if there's anything you can do there. This ended up being surprisingly practical for me. And the students, they took full ownership of this. I was shocked by these remedial kids, not to label them, but they were in a remedial class. I was absolutely shocked about how much they cared about showing me new evidence and how much of ownership of that they took upon themselves. So to wrap up very quickly with grading, others have talked about it. Peter talks about it in his book as well. To me, the actual reporting that counts of communicating student learning is this grid with the accompanying descriptions, because that's what's informing students and parents about where their students at and where they need to go. So that to me is ultimately what's important. But in this system of having to, if you do have to report a grade like we do at 8, 9, or a percentage like we do at 10 to 12, then what can we do? So one option is this sort of holistic judgment. So I can look at this as a whole and kind of say, okay, you know what, I see a lot of proficient, but not everything's proficient, but a few extendings there. So I might give this a proficient overall. I might give this a letter grade of B overall, or use a benchmark percent. Mike Pruner talked about that in his thing, where he's got these sort of benchmark percentage things, like a 75 or an 80, and just kind of looking at it holistically. And I think that's fine. You may want it. What I did was I used a scale, and for me it was 2, 3, 4, 5, because I designed my emerging questions as not yet passing, and developing though was still significant enough that I thought they were in that passing range, and so I used the 2, 3, 4, 5 scale. But other teachers use a different scale across here. Sometimes they weigh standards differently as well, so that can factor into it. But in the end, the numbers that it produced, even though I hated that I was producing a number, it gelled with what I felt matched for that student. And I didn't find myself going around and fudging some marks to fit with what my experience was. I found there was a lot of alignment with that. And maybe you have some other ideas. So some next steps as we wrap this up, and I can entertain some questions as well. And Peter, feel free to jump in here at any time too, as well, because you're part of this planning as to where this is going. Oh, that didn't mean to come up yet. So, oh yeah, so trying something. You know, we've had these other sessions. We've had a lot of things that I've covered today, and I've just kind of summarized them there. But just try one thing. We hope you come back to a later thing in the series. We hope you come back. We will announce the dates and so on to our BCMT members and through the listserv and so on. But just try something. You know, plan around it. You know, be intentional. Put it into practice. Reflect on how that went. Revisit your plan. Put that into practice and so on. Even if it's just one thing. It really helps to collaborate, to connect. We have this whole group here that has people that you could connect with, people in your school, somebody next door. It really helps so that you're not doing this work alone. And always keep in mind, like, what are you learning about your students? That's got to be ultimately the goal of what we're trying to do here. So, as Peter mentioned, this is going to be kind of transforming, and Peter will probably say a little bit more about this. But we really hope that people are going to come, and we're actually going to start off each session with some sharing about things that you've tried, what's worked well for you, what maybe hasn't worked well for you. Any little thing is worth sharing because we all learn. I've learned so much by hearing the stories of others. We're going to be inviting a guest speaker to kind of show an example of what's been working for them. And I'm happy to announce, I think maybe it's not totally official yet because the committee hasn't gotten back to me, but it's perhaps going to be Alicia Dublin from Surrey, who's going to be sharing some things next time with us. And then just have some general question and answer with the rest of the time there.
And some small group discussion.
Ah, great. That'd be great too. So there's the address for the slides. Bitly's are case sensitive. So it's bit.ly math content MG, and I will paste this into the chat so that everybody has it. And that is my fire hydrant. I hope you at least got a few drops to satisfy a little part of your thirst. You're welcome to let your brain rest and go in your work, your dinner, your afternoon plans or whatever. But I'll be here. Others are here as well if people want to have a chat about anything that I talked about or anything about assessment in general. To either put something in the chat or unmute yourself.
Maybe you can stop the screen share for a moment.
Yep, I'm going to do that.
So thank you very much, Marc, for that really enlightening presentation and so many different dimensions to think about that new light through an old window. And thanks for the comments at the end, talking about what's coming to people in the future. April 7th is the next date, and I think we can all agree that it is going to be Alicia Dublin. And we are going to use that newer structure of having more sharing, more small group discussion, more Q&A, shorter and more focused insertions of ideas. And then Mike, do you want to say a little bit about how people are going to register for this?
Yeah, we're going to send out a registration link probably over the next few days. It'll be on the listserv through Twitter and through probably an e-news or something like that. And the way the registration works is if you are currently, can you guys hear the birds in the background? I can hardly hear myself speak. If If you're currently a BCMT member, then we are asking that you still register, but registration will be free. And if you are not currently a BCMT member, which is likely due to not attending our last conference, then there'll be a small membership fee. I believe it's $40 for public school teachers and $60 for independent schools. And that just covers membership. We're not making any money off of this at all. So that link will be coming out to you. And then after registration, we will then have your email and we'll be sending out a Zoom address for you to participate in our next meeting.
Yeah. And look for the announcements on the listserv, and we will also post it on the BCMT Twitter. And if you're following any one of us, we'll retweet that as well. So you'll be well informed. So this is part of that transition from just a conversation that emerged at the fall conference now to being a more focused initiative by the BCMT. And thank goodness for them continuing to support this, because there is such a thirst for conversations around assessment in this province right now. But let's not take away the thunder from Marc. So Marc, you certainly provoked us. There must be some questions. Let's see what people have to say.
And by the way, at the end of the PDF, those slides, I threw in a few more slides that had other descriptive scales for other topics, just so you'd have some more examples to look at. I haven't seen any questions yet, just a few comments.
Ah, yeah, there's a question for you, Marc.
Well, that's what that 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of scale was getting in at the end. So, and I meant to talk about, how many standards would you have in total? So I used a 5-point scale, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I had 20 standards. So that's 100%. And so it was kind of like every shift in a, for any particular standard would have that sort of, 5% impact? Anyway, or 1% impact. Anyway, so it ended up translating into a percentage. So at any moment, I was able to easily convert from that sort of student record sheet into a percent for reporting purposes. But like I said, I hated doing it, but I had to.
Yeah.
And the students, they weren't focused on the numbers. They were focused on where they were at in that progression across, and what did it mean to be able to move from one to the next. And that to me was the main thing.
And I can support that, because I've worked in classrooms. I was working in one classroom in Ottawa, and this was the advanced function class. All of these students are going to university, and in a standards-based assessment setting, they weren't talking about how to get more marks. They were talking about how they were going to evidence further learning. And it was with each other, talking about how they were going to achieve the learning and then evidence the learning, so that they can continue to progress.
Yes, Phil, that it did kind of translate that way. Like I said, others have a different kind of scale where it doesn't break down in a linear progression or an arithmetic progression. Now, for others, emerging means passing, and so they might use like a 3, 4, 5, 6 scale or some equivalent like that. So emerging can mean different things for different teachers. Extending can mean different things for different teachers, and that's okay. Because what I am asking, so let's say, if emerging isn't, I hate even talking about passing, failing, and all that. But anyway, 50%. If emerging is lower than 50% for me, and for another teacher it is 50%, it doesn't mean that our grading practices are not aligned with each other, because I'm asking those questions at the emergent level that the teacher who thinks emerging is passing would agree is not yet passing. their emergent questions are what I would consider, yeah, I would pass students who can do those things. So it's about that. What are we looking for? And then giving students opportunities for that. You know, those will, if we have different beliefs about what's passing, those things that we're looking for and the evidence that we're gathering will also be different. So I think it all translate out in the end to be consistent. Overall, I mean, there's going to be differences, obviously, from one teacher to another.
Thanks for that comment, Sandra. I think that's an important thing to remember, is that students enter the system eternally optimistic and enthusiastic. And it's the system that changes that. And we have to work against that.
We have a question about, do I find content competencies become more separated? I don't know. I guess it depends what you mean. I'm still, like, for me, like I said, I keep them separate. Like, they're always together. They support each other, but I can look at those different aspects of the evidence and I kind of use that. So I don't know about, I think that would remain the same for me in 10 to 12. For those who are merging them to form their learning standards, to me, the challenge there is, there's so many different combinations that you could grow into a very big list. And what if your intended competency that you were looking for ended up not showing up there in that piece of evidence, but something else did? In the end, you're still looking at a body of evidence. So I guess it all works out, but I struggle with that. Maybe it's because I'm still on a journey as well and I need to get there. But I don't think anything would change in the higher grades compared to the junior math.
I'm not sure.
And for students who, go ahead.
I'm not sure what that question is asking exactly, but one of the interesting things that I've noticed is that by creating that distinction between the learning standards and the proficiency levels, I was originally worried that I was atomizing mathematics to these discrete competencies, so to speak. But the result was actually the opposite, that students started to see better connections between the discrete parts. Because they were seeing the differences, they were able to see the connections. I don't know if you had that experience, Mark. Did you have that experience?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, well, and yes, I have. And like I said, I continue to have, like, every week, it seems, I feel I'm learning something new or seeing a nuance that I hadn't seen before. Final assessment. Yeah, so yeah, for me, a final assessment is that final opportunity to show evidence. And so it's single purpose for me is that opportunity to provide new evidence. Now, in terms of a total retained knowledge, the sort of retained knowledge is an interesting thing that I didn't really get into, but in my summer situation, I was there. I had them for 3 weeks, so there wasn't a lot of time to revisit things. But I think, and now with the quota system, that's probably super challenging as well. But I would like to be very intentional about revisiting concepts, so that there's always this, everything that we've learned is always alive, and maybe that's even through doing a routine. So we might be studying one unit as part of our regular learning and so on, but we might, I might throw up a kind of routine for 15 minutes where I'm touching upon earlier stuff, because I want to keep all of that learning alive throughout the course, instead of just, okay, we're done that, now let's move on. So I do value that final experience of being able to see all things put together, but there are other ways of doing that. And I know actually Alicia Dublin has some interesting ideas about what she's done to kind of capture that whole learning of the course. And so that might be something that she can talk about in April. Nice to hear, Carol. Yeah. It is priceless. That's great.
I have a question. Do you mind if I jump in?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I guess the main question is around fairness. And the thing that always seems to hold me back from getting into the more holistic approach as much as I'd love to, and I always get these great nuggets of wisdom from these sessions around this holistic approach and the POC, which I have started to use within the classroom. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to report cards, I'm always so nervous about being quote unquote fair with my students, and that each person got the same opportunities. I think of with the POC of my one student who may have gotten, let's say, a 78 and didn't question it, just went with it and said, that's fine. And another student who comes and says, well, I'm not happy with that. I want to do more. And so we have the conversation, another opportunity may be provided. But, you know, as word circulates, it's like, oh, well, you gave them another chance, but you didn't give me another chance. And so it's just this sort of a miasma of being fair and what parents will come back with that always holds me back from fully jumping on board. And I just find I still want to stick to those percentages and those add them up values so that everybody can say, yep, there it is. That's why you're this. That's why they're that. I know it's more of a statement of a problem, but is there any insights anyone would like to share around that?
I can share a few, like maybe I can share a few general things, and Marc maybe has a few particulars. So this feeling of fairness is a cultural hangover that goes back over 100 years to the emergence of the IQ test and the belief that we could somehow measure people for purposes of ranking them. And it's been perpetuated for all these decades in our system. And it still lives there as a cultural hangover in the sense that somehow our grading is for the purposes of ranking. And it's just not true. There's nothing in our assessment standards that specifies that we're supposed to compare students against each other. We're supposed to assess a student's attainment of the curriculum. So we're supposed to assess them against standards, which means that everybody could have the same mark. Now what was interesting was you talked about opportunity. And I think one of the things that is interesting here is that I think you're conflating opportunities that students seize with opportunities that they are offered. So for example, in your scenario, Mike, you said like every student had the opportunity to come to you and talk about further chances to demonstrate learning. Not everyone sees that opportunity. And I think that's a really key distinction there in how we talk about opportunity offered versus opportunity seized. And I think Marc can talk about that through the context of what he shared today.
Yeah, absolutely. Like to me, that never emerged as a problem with the classes I've done it with, because it's part of that ongoing culture of the learning, and that everybody knew that these opportunities were there. It was an ongoing part. In fact, in some ways, as I think about it, if every student had the same, then that is inherently unfair. Then I am imposing on them that this is the way everybody is going to be able to show me what they know and what they can do, versus having that flexibility for each student to show their best. So I think this actually enhances the fairness. As Phil said, like fair doesn't mean equal. There's like this idea of being equitable to me is a really important idea. And you're right, there might be that pushback, but it's just a perception. Yeah. And it doesn't have to be there at all.
And we came to grips a long time ago with differentiated instruction. And this is just a form of differentiated assessment. But It's this idea, and I know where it's coming from, and I see it all the time, and it's part of the culture we all share. And you all have students in your classrooms that come from countries where report cards actually say 74%, three of 28, meaning that they're ranked third of 28 in their classroom. But it's not our job to rank our students. But universities use the marks that we give for the purposes of ranking and sorting, but that's not our job. The fact that we're generating data that they use for ranking purposes is different than what we should be doing. I don't know if that helps, Mike, but your inner desire is right.
Thanks. Those are great things. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, well, if it's winding down, and obviously we're end of the teaching day, there's a lot of exhaustion as well. This is going to be recorded. Somebody was asking about the video being shared. Yeah, this one we're going to share out. Future sessions, because they're going to be a little bit more informal. They're not going to be recorded. We really want to encourage people to be there, because it's really a lot about those conversations, the sharing, this kind of engagement piece. So they won't be shared, but we do hope to provide on our website, the BCMT website, with some kind of summary of things from one session to the next. There'll be a theme around whatever our guest speaker will be talking about, and a kind of a takeaway that goes along with that as well, of something to try. And so over time, we'll get to see the different things that we explore. So when we announce what Alicia will be doing, we just have to decide what her theme will be, but we hope that we will see many, if not all of you, in April. And bring your questions. Like, sharing a story doesn't have to be a success story. It could be something that you struggle with, just like Mike shared with us. These are really valuable things to talk about as well, because this is all the stuff that try something. And it's really, really hard to do alone. So finding somebody to connect with is really, really helpful.
And don't forget that the 4 presenters we've had so far are very approachable. So if you're trying something from Mike's sessions or Mark's sessions or Phil's session, and you want a bit more information, or you want to bounce ideas off them in the meantime, reach out to them. Okay, so we look forward to seeing you in April.
All right. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great evening and a great spring break eventually.